which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Kathy, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the June 14th issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Ukraine War Has Outlasted First World War by Constant Mayhout. The war in Ukraine has often been compared to World War I for its brutal infantry assaults and heavy casualties. Yet the idea that it could, by any measure, surpass a conflict so long and bloody that French soldiers hoped it would be the last of the last once seemed unthinkable. That is just what happened on Thursday. The war in Ukraine, which reached 1,569 days, or more than 4 years and 3 months, has now outlasted World War I. When President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia sent his troops into Ukraine in February 2022, he believed the government would fall within days. After Ukraine pushed the Russians back and the conflict settled into a war of attrition, even many of those fighting could not imagine it would last this long. I thought maybe 2 or 3 years and then politicians will find some kind of consensus, said a Ukrainian soldier who, for security reasons, gave only his call sign, France, a nod to his time in the French Foreign Legion. But the war has raged on, and with peace talks stalled, it shows no sign of ending soon. Polls suggest that about half of Ukrainians believe it will not end before next year, which would push it closer to another threshold, the duration of World War II, which lasted 6 years. And there are many Ukrainians who would argue that the current war really began in 2014 when Russian troops seized Crimea. Historians caution that drawing parallels with the two world wars has limits. The global scale of those conflicts, involving many theaters and armies, makes comparisons about casualties and firepower difficult. Ukraine did not exist as a country during World War I. Still, the war in Ukraine, like World War I, is likely to rank among the most consequential conflicts in modern European history, said Yaroslav Ristak, a Ukrainian historian. Both wars transformed Europe's geopolitics by reshaping military alliances and driving a defense buildup not seen in decades. Military analysts also note that both conflicts reshaped the nature of warfare through the introduction of new technologies. Planes and tanks a century ago, drones across the air, sea, and land today. In both cases, the advances made war only more brutal for humans. In many respects, this war in Ukraine is the one that most closely resembles World War I, said Michael Goya, a former French colonel and a military historian. The comparison begins with the opening phase of both wars. In 1914, the Germans launched a rapid offensive towards Paris in the hope of securing a swift victory. Russian forces had the same objective when they raced towards Kyiv, Ukraine's capital, in 2022. In both cases, the attackers came close to their target but were ultimately driven back. Eventually, both wars settled into mostly static fighting along a largely frozen front. When soldiers on the Ukrainian battlefield hunkered down in trenches and bunkers in late 2022, historians described it as a return to World War I-style trench warfare. Scenes from the trenches of eastern Ukraine mirrored those in northern France a century earlier. Ukrainian and Russian troops were often separated by just a few hundred yards, sometimes close enough to see one another. Assaults began with artillery barrages to pin down the opponent, followed by the storming of enemy trenches by infantry squads. In general, when the front freezes, you're back to World War I, Mr. Goya said. In both wars, he added, it was the intensity of firepower, mainly artillery, that forced both armies to turn to trenches. You bare yourself to protect yourself, he said. That calculus later changed in Ukraine with the introduction of a new class of weapons: drones. Networks of open trenches were rendered unsafe as drones monitored the battlefield around the clock and struck with greater precision than artillery shells. Now, Ukrainian soldiers say survival depends on going smaller and deeper. Instead of sprawling trench systems, troops shelter in dugouts housing no more than a handful of soldiers. Such bunkers are small enough to be difficult to spot from the sky and deep enough to withstand strikes. A soldier operating on his own will often dig a position barely larger than a foxhole. In a recent interview near Ukraine's southern front, a Ukrainian commander, who also gave only his call sign, Sour, for security reasons, recalled how his troops had to storm a well-fortified Russian dugout 4 times before forcing the soldiers inside to surrender. The dugout had right-angled corners reinforced with metal sheets designed to absorb an explosive shock wave, he said. The commander, who leads the 5th Center of the International Legion, part of Ukraine's military intelligence forces, said he took the captured Russian soldier to his unit's training ground and asked him to dig a similar position so he could study how it was built. In this environment, the people who dig survive longer and stay safer, France, the Ukrainian soldier said. As drones have come to dominate the battlefield, World War I-style opposing trench networks, separated by a narrow buffer zone, have given way to a miles-wide contested combat area scattered with dugouts. In this kill zone, any movement is quickly targeted by drones. Large-scale troop assaults of the kind seen a century ago have become all but impossible under the constant gaze of drones. Such assaults have been replaced with attacks by just 1 or 2 soldiers. Tanks, first introduced in 1916, were still a feared weapon in the first years of the war in Ukraine. They are rarely used now because their size makes them easy targets for drones, though some tanks have been retrofitted with protective metal cages that turn them into Mad Max-style vehicles. While the battlefield today bears less and less resemblance to that of a century ago, the scale of the destruction looks remarkably similar. In Ukrainian command posts near the front, live footage from reconnaissance drones shows scenes reminiscent of World War I battlefields: splintered trees, ruined houses, and fields pockmarked by shell craters. Casualties are difficult to compare, given the difference in scale between the 2 wars. A century ago, millions of soldiers were sent into battle across multiple fronts in Europe. Today, the forces involved number in the hundreds of thousands. Roughly 9 million to 11 million soldiers died in World War I, compared with about 500,000 in Ukraine so far. Still, military analysts and officials, including Admiral Pierre Verdier, who holds the post of Supreme Allied Commander Transformation in NATO, says drones have made the Ukrainian battlefield lethal levels comparable to World War I. Admiral Vondler made the comparison after a study trip to Ukraine this spring. So grinding is the fighting in Ukraine that Russian advances have at times been slower than those in some of World War I's most deadlocked battles. Russia's offensive on Pokrovsk, an eastern Ukrainian city it recently fully captured, progressed at an average pace of about 75 yards per day, slower than in the bloody Battle of the Somme during World War I, according to analysis by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a Washington-based think tank. The question now is whether either side can break the deadlock. In World War I, the Allies prevailed by combining economic pressure on Germany through a tight naval blockade with military pressure through relentless offensives. Ukraine's strategy to end the war carries some echoes of that approach. Drone strikes on Russia's oil assets, the backbone of its economy, are designed to curb Moscow's ability to finance its war effort. Kyiv lacks the manpower to replicate the offensives of World War I, but it has flooded the battlefield with small attack drones in the hope of inflicting unsustainable losses on the Russian army. This is World War I, but with drones, Mr. Herstak, the historian, said. Iran wants more from talks. New leaders are willing to take risks. By Stephen Erlanger. The United States and Israel went to war in Iran seeking regime change. Nearly 4 months later, there has been regime change, but not the kind they wanted. The Islamic Republic 3.0, as some call it, is now less a theocracy and more a military junta dominated by the powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Washington and Jerusalem also went to war to eradicate Iran's nuclear program and end the threat it poses. So far, this conflict has only produced a wounded Iran more willing to take risks and more likely to persist in its goal of advancing its nuclear program. The United States and Iran traded blows this past week while trying to find a path towards settling the war. By Friday, despite accusations of duplicity from both sides, officials in Tehran and Washington said they were closing in on a deal, while emphasizing that an initial agreement, known as a Memorandum of Understanding, had not yet been finalized. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araki said that an agreement had never been closer. Even agreement on the memorandum will leave Tehran with some leverage, as the two sides engage in serious negotiations on Iran's nuclear program and its future role in the Strait of Hormuz. Many details will be left to a 60-day period for negotiations, which may or may not succeed. In the course of this war, Iran has gone from appearing weak and defenseless to a regime not only surviving, but also retaining important military and nuclear abilities. Iran's extensive security apparatus seems firmly in control of all aspects of government, society, and foreign policy. Iran is now led by a younger, more brazen generation in power, said Sanam Vakil, the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, in what Aaron David Miller, a former American diplomat at the Carnegie Endowment, called a transition from divine power to hard power. These new leaders believe they can survive even a major renewal of fighting without significantly altering their negotiating positions or their larger regional aims. Those aims include to restore their power of deterrence so that they cannot be attacked again as they were in late February. They also want to maintain the right to enrich uranium even at low levels after a period of suspension, and will retain the scientific knowledge and equipment that would allow them, should they choose, to again become a nuclear threshold state, one that would have all the elements of a nuclear weapon without having put one together. The new Iranian government has shown itself to be a tough negotiator, willing to accept a high level of pain to preserve its core interests. This attitude is very different from the caution shown by the previous supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who was assassinated on the first day of the war, February 28th. He had for years banned the production of a nuclear weapon and always worked to avoid a joint Israeli-American attack on Iran. Having survived the attack, Iran's leaders no longer feel those same constraints. They are convinced, analysts say, that President Trump has no intention of restarting a full-scale war, and they note that he has put limits on Israel's desire to do so. That helps explain why Iran, for the first time last week, dared to directly attack Israel after Israel bombed the strongholds of Hezbollah, Iran's proxy in Beirut, Lebanon, which Israel had regularly done for months. Iran's attack on Israel was also a way for Iran to connect its demand for a ceasefire in Lebanon to the negotiations with the United States over ending the war in Iran. Israel wants to keep the issues separate. With the new regime, objectives that the United States and Israel have not achieved through war will not be achieved through more coercion, said Ali Vaez, the Iran project director for the International Crisis Group. The Iranians believe the worst is behind them, he said, and they will work to retain their core demands: their right to uranium enrichment, their ballistic missile program, and their support for their proxies like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Under any deal, experts say, Iran is likely to agree to a limited suspension of enrichment and to agree that half of its current stockpile of highly enriched uranium will be exported and the other half diluted to a lower level of enrichment. But Iran would still retain its nuclear knowledge and infrastructure, including advanced centrifuges. That, together with an ability to shut down the Strait of Hormuz again whenever it chooses, will give Iran a card to prevent Israel and the United States from attacking again, argued Danny Citrinowicz, a retired Israeli military intelligence officer who specializes in Iran. It will also give Iran renewed influence in the region. A war meant to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons will be the war that pushed them over the Rubicon, he said. He and others point out that before the war, Iran had offered Mr. Trump's envoys in Geneva a better deal than it is currently offering the nuclear negotiations with the United States. A newly emboldened Iran is likely to press harder for its other demands. Iran wants some $12 billion in frozen assets released up front, with another $12 billion as a later payment for progress on carrying out any deal. The Iranians want to test Mr. Trump's willingness to face down what will be strong opposition from some Republicans and Israel about handing over money to Iran. As for the key nuclear issues, other than an Iranian commitment not to build a bomb, they are largely left for more detailed negotiations over the following 60 days. Iran is also continuing to demand that it be able to charge ships in some fashion to use the Strait of Hormuz. Despite its willingness to take risks, Iran wants a deal to ease the growing economic pressure in the country and to allow it to sell the oil it has been pumping but storing through the American blockade of the strait. Iran's economy is in tatters and could produce more anti-regime protests once the war finally ends. But Iran believes that Mr. Trump is in even more of a hurry, so it has not been making the concessions Washington wants, Ms. Vikal said. Iran's long-term goals remain, she said, to prevent a future attack, to divide the Arab nations of the Gulf over how far to accommodate it, to push for the alienation of Israel among Arab states, and to diminish U.S. military presence and abilities in the region. The risk, she said, is that Iran will overplay its hand and miscalculate, as it has in the past. Even with an early deal, the analysts doubt that the negotiations will ever get to the thornier issues, like a detailed nuclear agreement, much as the Gaza agreement Mr. Trump negotiated has stalled. So we're likely to be in a limbo state for a long time, which is to Iran's advantage, said Suzanne Maloney, an Iran specialist at the Brookings Institution. No war, no peace is comfortable for Iran, she said, because it will only increase pressure on Mr. Trump to take any kind of deal to free up the strait and try to restore equilibrium in the market for energy, fertilizer, aluminum, and so much more. Iranians left in limbo by erratic war reports, by Farnaz Fasihi. For days, Iranians have gone to bed hearing the sounds of explosions or reports that their country and the United States were trading fire. And then they have awakened to news that the attacks had concluded and negotiations for a peace deal were still ongoing. On Thursday, the pendulum again swung wildly. Within a few hours, first, President Trump threatened to hit Iran very hard and take over Karg Island, Iran's oil export hub. Then he abruptly canceled attacks because, he said, progress had been made in peace negotiations. Between the president's two statements, Tehran's armed forces had threatened retaliation against energy infrastructure in the region if attacked. For ordinary Iranians, the constant vacillation between fear and relief, anxiety and hope, has been emotionally taxing. In phone interviews and text messages, some said that they just wanted the war to end one way or another. They go to war at night, they stop the war by morning, it's all ridiculous, said Vahid, a 37-year-old resident of Tehran, who, like most ordinary Iranians interviewed, asked that his last name not be used for fear of retribution. Either fight or don't fight, he added. We are fed up. Streams of people flowed out of Tehran, the capital, on Thursday in reaction to Mr. Trump's threats. The three main roads leading north out of the city toward the coast of the Caspian Sea were jammed with traffic, the deputy police chief told local news media. Reza, a 48-year-old manager of a company, and his wife decided to take a weekend trip to the north and wait out the latest wave of tensions, he said in a phone interview. He said they worried the United States could strike civilian infrastructure, a concern fueled by a recent strike in the South, which destroyed a facility that a New York Times analyst found appeared to be for drinking water. Work is very slow. Businesses are paralyzed because of fluctuating prices. It feels like our life is on hold right now, said Reza. In addition to concerns about their safety in the event of another all-out war, Iranians who were interviewed said they worried the economy would further collapse if the conflict remained in limbo. They say that if tit-for-tat strikes become the norm and the naval blockade against Iran's ports continues, daily life will become even harder. In his post calling off planned strikes, Mr. Trump said the blockade would remain in full force and effect until a deal was reached. Mahasti, a 65-year-old resident of Tehran working in the health sector, said that as bad bombs were being dropped because the disruptions to trade and the curtailing of Iran's oil revenues were slowly deteriorating many Iranians' quality of life. Our lives are just getting more and more difficult by the day, she said. If it's not war, it's sanctions or blockade, always something. Some took to social media to vent. Iman Vagafi, a sociologist in Tehran, wrote on social media after the news of Wednesday night's attacks that he had lived in a state of anxiety and suspense for the past 6 months. Another night of terror and dread from the assault and explosion, he said. President Masoud Pezeshkian acknowledged the status quo was not tenable in a speech at a ceremony commemorating the late Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. We must get out of this no war, no peace situation. War is definitely not to the benefit of the country, he said, adding, however, that military aggression would not make Iran surrender. Adding to Iranians' confusion, Mr. Trump on Thursday afternoon claimed once again that a deal was close, saying it could be signed maybe over the weekend in Europe. The spokesman for Iran's foreign ministry said Tehran had not yet reached a final conclusion about the agreement, according to Iran's state broadcaster. The Existential Dread of a Deepfake Expert by Eli Saslow, Berkeley, California. The emails began to arrive on a Sunday morning, as the worst ones often did. Hani Farid opened the first message at his home in the hills above Berkeley and found a link to a viral video purporting to show a U.S.-made missile hitting an elementary school in Iran, where more than 150 people had been killed, most of them children. Is this an internet hoax or an international war crime? One note read. We're trying to verify what's real. Farid grabbed a pencil and a notepad, leaned into his computer, and watched. He saw blue sky, telephone wires, and a few palm trees swaying in the wind. And then a missile streaked across the screen, clear and unmistakable, even at 500 miles per hour. It looked like a scene from a video game. In the last few days, Farid had reviewed dozens of convincing AI-generated videos of fake bombings, fake plane crashes, fake fires, and fake executions. His instinct was to be skeptical. He was nearly certain the video was another fake. He chewed on his pencil and watched it, again, slowing down the video, breaking it apart frame by frame. The camera shook in a way that seemed plausible for an amateur filming with a cell phone. The shadows were geometrically accurate. He watched the missile strike a building and noticed a short delay before he heard an explosion and high-pitched screams, which seemed consistent with the speed of sound. Maybe the video was real. It had already been viewed at least 1.1 million times on social media. With each passing second, it was becoming reality, whether it was real or not. Anyone can create a video of anything or anybody doing or saying anything, Fareed wrote back. This will take a little time. For more than 2 decades, Fareed, 60, had been the world's leading expert in the field of digital forensics. But in the last 6 months, he'd stopped trusting his own eyes. He'd made a career of differentiating visual reality from deepfakes as he fielded requests each day from governments, human rights organizations, journalists, law enforcement, and thousands of others who were increasingly confused and deceived by the online world. Fareed's own research had proved that most people could no longer distinguish a real photograph from a digital creation, a real voice from an AI clone, a real video from a wholesale fabrication. Lately, he was failing his own tests. I feel like I'm going blind, Fareed said, and he worried that AI was obscuring the truth, distorting reality, fracturing democracies, and slowly breaking him, too. He and his wife had begun making plans to leave California and trade the tech culture of Silicon Valley for a farm in rural Vermont. He restarted the video and played the clip again. Sky, bomb, smoke, screams. In the last hour, at least a dozen news media organizations had emailed him to ask about the video. It had been published and shared by an official Iranian news agency, but that didn't mean much to Fareed, because recently he had seen deepfakes created and shared by foreign governments and by staffers at the White House. He geolocated the video using a database of millions of images from around the globe, and it pointed to a street in Minab, Iran, several hundred feet from an elementary school. Maybe the video itself was real, Fareed thought, except that someone had inserted a Tomahawk missile into the frame. He stabilized the video to get rid of the shaking and then sharded the missile through a series of still frames, hunting for inconsistencies. The missile's path was straight, its speed consistent. He zoomed in to measure pixels and calculated that the missile looked to be about 18 feet long, exactly the right size. Sky, bomb, smoke, screams. He watched at least 100 more times, doubting his instincts and rechecking his math. For most of his career, he had been charged with identifying the rare fake in a world of shared truths. But now, fakes were the norm, and truth was elusive. Even after a full day of analysis and consultation with other visual experts, all of which confirmed the video's authenticity, he couldn't quite bring himself to declare it real. Overall, we find no compelling evidence that the video is fake or has been manipulated, Fareed wrote. He turned off the computer and went outside. He rode his mountain bike through the Berkeley Hills, pushing his speed and leaning into the wind. He smoked a cigar and went to bed, and later that night he returned to the video in his sleep. This time he wasn't counting pixels or measuring shadows. He was inside the school, sitting down in a classroom of 10-year-olds, watching the warhead detonate, absorbing the concussive blast, coughing up dust and listening to the children's screams. He woke up and went back to the computer, scanning the internet for news about the bombing. You can't kill 100 schoolgirls and just say, whoopsie, he wrote to a colleague as he read through social media posts. Some people were citing Fareed's analysis to confirm the video was real. Others dismissed Fareed as somehow biased and said the video looked fake. Several AI-generated videos about the bombing had already begun to appear online, showing fake generals giving orders or fake parents mourning fake schoolgirls. The internet was already moving on from what would turn out to be one of the deadliest bombings of the war, and now Fareed saw a new request arrive in his inbox. It was a different video, showing another explosion in a separate part of the world. Can you please help us understand what the hell is going on here? You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Was that really President Joe Biden calling thousands of Democratic voters the day before the New Hampshire primary and telling them not to vote? Was that really President Trump tossing bags of garbage out of a third-floor window at the White House? Were those real nude photos of ninth graders circulating around a high school in Pennsylvania, or images that a classmate had generated with a free app? Was that really Tom Hanks advertising an obscure dental plan to his fans? Was that the CEO on the video call asking for a wire transfer of $25 million, or a North Korean impersonator? Was that a real gun in Alex Preddy's hand, or just a shadow? Was that really a 12-year-old daughter on the phone screaming for help, saying that she'd been kidnapped? I miss the days when it was a grainy video of a shark swimming up the street, Fareed said one night as he sat on the back deck of his house with his wife, Emily Cooper. He put down his phone and poured a whiskey. The technology is getting so good. It takes me to a dark place. Because you can't tell just by looking anymore? Cooper asked. Because nobody can, Fareed said. I don't trust anything. Every image I see, I'm drawing lines for shadows and doing geometry in my head, trying to figure out what I'm looking at. It's over. Within a year or two, our whole visual system will be utterly useless. And then what? You give up? You retire? I don't know, he said. They had met 15 years earlier when Fareed came to lecture at the University of California, Berkeley, still confident he had the solutions. His father had worked for 50 years as a chemist at Eastman Kodak, and Fareed had grown up visiting the darkroom, watching photographs develop in chemical baths and harden into evidence. He went on to help design a digital fingerprint that found child pornography hiding on the internet, a technology that led to more than 30 million abuse reports each year, hundreds of arrests, and several rescues. As deepfakes began spreading online, he built software to catch at the moment a speaker's mouth moved out of sync with the audio. He helped found a company, Get Real Security, and helped invent tools to measure lighting, shadows, and vanishing points, checking online visuals against the physics of the real world. Cooper was a leading vision scientist at Berkeley. She researched how humans perceive reality, while her husband investigated how that reality could be faked. They'd collaborated on studies about deepfakes, but in the last months, that research had begun to follow them home. Instead of dealing with one case every few months, Fareed was working as an advisor and an expert witness, juggling up to a dozen cases each day. For the first time in his career, he'd become not just an analyst, but also a victim when someone spoofed his cell phone number and used AI to clone his voice. The hacker made calls to one of Fareed's colleagues on a sensitive case, impersonating Fareed and pressing for confidential information. Now, Fareed and Cooper had decided never to take their identity for granted. They invented a safe word to confirm they were real at the start of any sensitive phone call. Fareed glanced at his phone and saw a new email. I'm fact-checking this viral video of a mother and child approaching a flag-draped coffin that we suspect is AI-generated, it read. He set the phone back down and looked out from the porch at the Berkeley Hills, the San Francisco Bay, and the sun setting over the Golden Gate Bridge. I can't stand this place anymore, he said. These major tech giants will burn everything to the ground as long as they're making a profit. They're not interested in anything that's going to slow them down. It makes me anxious for our students, Cooper said. It's starting to scare me. She didn't believe in hyperbole. Her husband could be brash and combustible, an optimist by nature who had turned increasingly pessimistic by evidence. She stuck to precision and facts, but even those had become undeniable. Her own research focused on 3D perception and display designs, but the broader crisis unfolding in her field was impossible to ignore. People were spending more time indoors, staring at screens, and less time looking at the horizon, which sometimes caused the eyeball to permanently elongate. The result was often blurred vision, skyrocketing rates of myopia, an increasing risk of eye disease, and an impending epidemic of preventable blindness that many of her colleagues had begun calling a public health crisis. The potential cure was natural light and distant views, and over the last months they had searched for properties in rural Vermont. They bought a 1920s cabin about half an hour from Dartmouth College, where they could work as tenured faculty and continue their research, while Farid continued to analyze images for his company. The property had 100 acres of wooded hiking trails with no other homes within sight. "I need to reset," Farid said. "Air, space. I'm so ready to feel far away." His phone lit up on the table. "Do you think it's even possible to escape?" Cooper asked. "Probably not," Farid said. "At least not entirely. But we need to find out." He rode down from the hills on his motorcycle to give his last public lecture of the spring semester at Berkeley, passing the AI billboards that had become ubiquitous across the Bay Area. They were for startups promising to reinvent medicine, disrupt education, and transform the future of business. "Stop hiring humans," one billboard read. Farid parked on campus and walked into the lecture hall, where 75 students looked back at him. He was one of Berkeley's most popular professors, kinetic, unfiltered, and genuinely thrilled by the advancements in AI technology at the heart of his courses. He had AI agents that wrote code for him. He had a car that could drive itself on the highway. He had apps on his phone that could tighten the phrasing in his emails or turn a photograph of his spice drawer into a recipe for weeknight chili. But the computer science majors in his classes were struggling to find jobs as companies waited to see what machines could do first. For the first time in his career, Farid sometimes stood in front of his students and found himself at a loss for what to tell them. He thought about a painting that had haunted him ever since he was a young professor at Dartmouth, where the library featured a mural by the Mexican artist Jose Clemente Orozco. It showed a group of academics rendered as skeletons in their graduation robes, clutching books, their backs turned to a burning world, as one of them delivered a baby skeleton holding a new diploma. "A lot of academia is content just twiddling around on esoteric problems and coddling each other from the truth," Farid said. He had spent his career trying not to be that skeleton. He believed it was his responsibility to turn and face the fire. "This technology is being weaponized against us," he told the students. "The train has left the station. It's accelerating at a speed that's unbelievable." He paced at the front of the room and started to show slides of AI videos from the last several years. A fake image of the Pentagon exploding had briefly rattled the stock market in 2023, erasing more than $500 billion in a few minutes. Deepfakes from the war in Ukraine were still fairly easy to identify, with discolored explosions and misshaped buildings. Gaza fakes were much better. By the start of the Iran war, short AI footage was essentially indistinguishable from real video. Now, thousands of North Korean government operatives were applying for remote jobs at U.S. companies, using AI to impersonate Americans in real time on video calls, and then funding a nuclear weapons program with their salaries. A non-technical criminal, Farid said, could now use a still photograph and an audio clip to shapeshift into anyone online. "You might think you can look and tell the difference while you're sitting there doom scrolling," he said. "Believe me, you can't. That's where our methods come in." He had helped invent algorithmic tools to verify a person's mannerisms, vocal inflections, and blood flow. When a real person spoke, the eyes dilated and the heart pumped blood in and out of the face. Farid could sometimes measure subtle differences in skin color to see a person's heart beating in real time, whereas an AI avatar was flatlined. Farid said he was still confident he could solve almost any AI mystery, But the problem was that each took time. The half-life of an average social media post was less than 90 seconds. Within 20 minutes, the whole ballgame is basically over, Fareed said. Many times he finished his analysis, looking up from his computer and realizing the damage was already done. A fake had hardened into a fact. A fact had blurred into doubt. A hand went up in the audience. So the creation of deepfakes is easy, cheap, fast, and reliable, the student said. Detection is costly and difficult. Yes, Fareed said. Is there a solution in the near future, or are we just screwed? He paused and took a breath. He thought about the Orozco mural, the school in Iran, the deepfakes piling up in his inbox, and the farm waiting in Vermont. He still believed there were solutions. But first, people had to understand what they were up against. We're pretty screwed, he said. The chainsaw roared to life on a Tuesday morning in late spring, and Fareed put on eye protection and felt the vibrations moving from his hands into his chest. He cut open a fallen maple tree and watched the wood splinter into clean logs, which Cooper then fed through the splitter and stacked into a neat pile. Cut, split, stack. They had been in Vermont for less than 2 weeks, and they'd already lost themselves in the work. Their cabin sat at the end of a dirt road, on a steep hill with views of river valleys and the Green Mountains. There was no garbage service, no mail delivery, no other houses in view. To get through the winter, they would need to plow their own road and heat the house. Fareed estimated they needed at least 10 tons of firewood. They worked for an hour and stepped back to look at the pile. We're doing great, Fareed said. It's so satisfying to watch it grow. Are you tired? Cooper asked. I feel good, he said. Let's keep going. We need more. They changed into boots and walked into the forest to search for dry wood. They'd been discovering their property one hike at a time, teaching themselves to slow down, to look closely. A meadow blooming with trillium and wild violet, a spring creek cascading over mossy granite, a red-winged blackbird diving over a small pond, an abandoned cabin decaying down to its foundation. Now they came into a clearing at the top of the hill, and Cooper stopped to look at the surrounding mountains while Fareed walked the perimeter. He found a fallen birch tree, grabbed a branch, and called out to Cooper over the wind. What do you think? He asked. It's beautiful, she said. She watched him carry the birch back through the meadows, holding it over his head like a trophy. Ever since they'd arrived in Vermont, she could almost see a weight lifting off his shoulders, and she was experiencing it too. She drank her tea in the morning, savoring the quiet and letting her eyes take in the view. She was experimenting with writing fiction. In the fall, Cooper and Fareed would start working and researching again at Dartmouth, but that wasn't for a few months. The last time they'd lived in Vermont, they'd relied on spotty dial-up internet without the bandwidth for video meetings or streaming videos or bottomless social media feeds. Maybe that level of disconnection was possible again. They hauled the birch back to the shed, and Fareed fired up his chainsaw. Cut, split, stack. They worked until the meadow faded into shadow. His shoulders burned and sawdust covered his arms. He stepped back and saw that the wood pile was almost 4 feet high and nearly covering one wall of the shed. Look at what we got done today, he said. This is the most concrete progress I've made on any work in the last 6 months. Tired yet? Cooper said. Exhausted, he said. He'd been going to bed in Vermont with the chainsaw still humming in his ears. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The first email came before dawn. The internet had been flooded with another wave of fake images, including hundreds of Cole Thomas Allen, who had broken into the White House Correspondents' Dinner with a shotgun in an attempt to assassinate President Trump. Now there was an AI-enhanced security video on Facebook that showed Allen walking by guards who didn't, in fact, exist. There were doctored photographs on X of Allen posing alongside Tom Hanks and Barack Obama. He had been a running back for the Dallas Cowboys. He had been an astronaut on Artemis II. He had been the private driver for Taylor Swift and Pope Leo XIV. Every time there's a big news event, we are just drowning in this slop, Fareed said. He pocketed his phone and went outside. He chopped wood and walked around the trails with Cooper, but the emails kept coming as they always did. We are looking at this new video of the incident involving United Flight 179. I'm verifying a video claiming to show a mosque being struck in southern Lebanon. I've been incarcerated since 2019 on false video evidence. He wandered deeper into the woods, searching for the edge of the property. He walked up a hill and found an old stone wall, chest high and at least 100 feet long, running through the middle of the forest. Fareed stood there for a while, tracing his hand over the moss and the faded gray stones, before he turned back toward the trail and checked his phone. I'd like to ask for your help investigating live-streamed sexual abuse material. Is this a real explosion at the Dubai airport? Could you offer your expertise? He circled back toward the front of their property. He walked past the woodpile and into the house. I'm going to catch up on a little work, he told Cooper. Okay, she said. Good, me too. He settled into his office and turned on his computer. Outside the window, birch trees swayed in the wind and the sun dipped toward the green mountains. He turned up the volume, opened a video, and heard a series of explosions. He leaned into the blue glow of the monitor and watched the fire burn. Why the White House Became a UFC Backdrop by Emmanuel Morgan. For more than a century, the South Lawn of the White House has hosted the Easter egg roll, where children use wooden spoons to race across the manicured grass. At Thanksgiving, presidents have used the area to ceremoniously pardon turkeys. But on Sunday, the South Lawn will hold the octagonal cage for 7 Ultimate Fighting Championship bouts, where half-naked men will punch, kick, and choke each other into submission. The unusual spectacle is a result of the decades-long friendship between President Trump and Dana White, the UFC's chief executive. The mixed martial arts fights are being held on the president's 80th birthday, which is also Flag Day. Here is what you need to know. How can you watch the fights? The event, known as UFC Freedom 250, is scheduled to begin at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be shown only on the Paramount Plus streaming service. Mr. White ruled out showing the fights on CBS, which has broader reach. Mr. White said that Ilia Topuria of Georgia and Justin Gaethje of the United States would enter the cage for their lightweight title bout after walking out from the Oval Office. There's also a heavyweight interim title bout between Alex Pereira of Brazil and Cyril Gane of France. The rest of the night's fighters are from the United States, Canada, and Brazil. Mr. White said Mr. Trump had requested that the heavyweight Derek Lewis be added to the lineup. Last year, the UFC signed a 7-year, $7.7 billion deal with Paramount, the media company owned by the tech scion David Ellison, to stream fights on Paramount Plus and air select fights on CBS. The administration is reviewing Paramount's planned acquisition of Warner Brothers Discovery after allowing Skydance's takeover of Paramount. The moves have brought accusations of Trump-friendly changes at CBS. On Friday, the Justice Department said it would not challenge the merger. Why is this happening? After Mr. White became president of the UFC in 2001, the league struggled to find sponsors, venues, and media partners because of its brutality. Mixed martial arts incorporates fighting styles such as boxing, Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu, and karate. Senator John McCain once called the sport human cockfighting. Mr. Trump, then a real estate magnate, allowed the UFC to host 2 events at the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Mr. White has said that the gesture was instrumental in placing the UFC on solid footing. Mr. Trump and Mr. White have stayed friends since. About a week after Mr. Trump won the 2024 election, he attended a UFC fight at Madison Square Garden. "What do you think about doing a fight at the White House?" Mr. White said in an interview, recalling what Mr. Trump said to him that night. For the president to lean over to me and ask me to be basically the main event for America's 250th birthday, I was blown away. Within days, White House officials called to start formal discussions, Mr. White said. Craig Borsari, the UFC's top production executive, soon flew to Washington to scout the venue, and Mr. White said Mr. Trump asked his eldest daughter, Ivanka, to oversee the planning. How close are Trump and White? Mr. Trump has been a public fan of the UFC during both his presidential terms. Since 2019, he had attended at least 10 of the league's events in Las Vegas, Miami, New York, and Newark. Mr. White has spoken for Mr. Trump at 3 Republican national conventions and at Mr. Trump's victory party on election night in 2024. During that presidential campaign, Mr. White facilitated interviews for Mr. Trump with several influencers in the so-called manosphere, including Joe Rogan, Aiden Ross, and the sports podcast Bussin' with the Boys. We're friends, Mr. White said. It's because this guy is Donald Trump and because he's the president of the United States. Everybody weirds out on it. What will Sunday's event look like? Capacity on the South Lawn is about 4,300 spectators, invited guests and military personnel, in an amphitheater-like venue with a 92-foot tall roof and a lighting grid nicknamed The Claw. Mr. Borsari, the production executive, said the seating capacity had expanded from 2,500 at Mr. Trump's request by placing seats in a more vertical configuration. Mr. Borsari said the UFC would pay to replace any damaged grass after the event. The Ellipse, a park near the White House, will host a watch party with more than 70,000 fans. Organizers will have a meteorologist on site to monitor the weather, and it could postpone the start time if needed. Temperatures could reach 90 degrees, and forecasts include rain, but officials said lightning was the primary concern. Mark Shapiro, the president of TKO Group Holdings, the parent company of the UFC and World Wrestling Entertainment, said it expected to spend more than $60 million on the event. That cost is nearly triple the amount the company spent to produce a fight at the Sphere in Las Vegas, but Mr. Shapiro said the brand exposure would be worth it, comparing it to the Super Bowl. What has the reaction been? Critics, including Governor Gavin Newsom of California and Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, have said the UFC event is a distraction from other issues, such as the war in Iran and high gas prices. On Friday, a judge declined to halt the event after a lawsuit was filed by 2 Virginia residents represented by the Public Integrity Project. Mr. White said he was unbothered by any of the criticism. There's always bad things going on in the world, he said. You have fanatical political people in this country and around the rest of the world that are going to have opinions on this thing, and this is a MAGA party. It is a fight with a global sport that happens to be an American company celebrating the 250th birthday of America on the South Lawn of the White House. It is what it is. Canada plans child social media ban by Vijosa Ise, Toronto. Canada is joining a growing list of countries seeking to protect young people from harm online by restricting their access to social media platforms. The Canadian government introduced a new digital safety program proposal on Wednesday that would require users to verify that they are at least 16 to gain access to websites like Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. A new regulator called the Digital Safety Commission of Canada would administer the proposed measures, officials said. Young people will be allowed on online platforms of companies that meet safety standards to be defined by the regulator, government officials told reporters on Wednesday. The proposal, the Safe Social Media Act, sponsored by Canada's Ministry of Identity and Culture, Mark Miller, would need to be passed by the House of Commons and Senate to become law. The safety of children can't be an afterthought, Mr. Miller said. We need basic protection in place so every child in this country can be safe on platforms they use every day. Over the past year, countries including Britain, Malaysia, France, Greece, and Spain have considered similar proposals to address issues among young people like mental health problems, including social media addiction and depression, as well as cyberbullying and distraction in schools. Australia became the first country to pass such legislation in November 2024, blocking young people from social media apps like TikTok, Snapchat, and YouTube. Under Australia's law, tech companies must disable the accounts of underage users or risk fines of up to $33 million. In response, platforms deactivated about 5 million accounts of underage users, the government said. But all of these countries have also faced opposition from some tech companies and civil society groups that say identity verification steps amount to surveillance and introduce risks that personal data could be hacked. The United States headquarters to many of the world's largest social media companies strongly opposes regulations that would use government-issued identification to check ages because of the potentially chilling impact on civil liberties. Officials in the U.S. have said they favor much more narrowly defined regulations targeting pornographic and gambling sites, for example. As Canada weighs imposing safety regulations on tech companies, it has considered relaxing other requirements. This month, the government decided to reassess a policy that would require foreign streamers to invest in Canadian programming. The government said it wanted to prevent costs from being passed on to consumers, but critics have accused it of making the decision to appease the Trump administration. The online safety measures introduced on Wednesday could have the same fate, said Michael Geist, a professor at the University of Ottawa who studies technology regulation. Excluding a segment of users from social media platforms, rather than establishing effective regulations to make the internet better for everyone, Dr. Geist said, feels like a Band-Aid solution. A Meta spokeswoman, Julia Pereira, said the company was assessing the details of the plan. Like lawmakers, we want safe, positive online experiences for young people, she said, while calling social media bans counterproductive and raising concerns about leaving age verification up to individual platforms. With teens using more than 40 apps weekly, it is important that any regulations apply equally across the many apps, Ms. Pereira said. TikTok did not immediately respond to requests for a comment. An attempt by Canada in 2024 to regulate tech giants, called the Online Harms Act, failed amid fears of limits on freedom of speech. Other aspects of that act, including taking some sexually explicit content down and imposing liabilities on platforms that failed to do so, were resurrected in Wednesday's bill. Australia's e-safety commissioner surveyed parents in a report published in March that said that about 31% of children continued to have access to their own accounts on at least one social media platform, down from 50% before the ban went into effect. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the June 14th issue of the front section of the New York Times. We read from the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1 p.m. Your reader has been Kathy. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times opinion page. Following that at 3 o'clock, the New York Times Arts and Leisure, and at 4 o'clock, a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Radio Reading mails out a large print program schedule to our listeners every other month. If you have not received a Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service large print program schedule in the mail, please call us at 716-821-5555. We will make sure that you receive one every other month. A Braille version of the schedule is also available upon request. Our number again is 716-821-5555. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability.